So In Good Faith is a really important initiative of the Bernardin Center. And as you know, it's dedicated to furthering our efforts at interreligious dialogue and deepening our understanding and developing relationships among Jewish, Christian, and Muslim leaders in the Chicago area. So here we are again, once again, this year to hear about and reflect on the issues that are important to our community. Our topic for this evening is authority and the parameters of dissent in our traditions. Presenters have been asked to address what types of dissent in matters of religion are tolerable, what is permissible and legitimate, and what is not. We have three ultimately very qualified presenters this evening, and I'd like to invite our panelists to come forward. Emily Soloff is the Associate Director of Interreligious and Intergroup Relations for the American Jewish Committee. She began her work in interreligious and intergroup relations many years ago and has staffed numerous Jewish-Christian dialogue groups, Christian clergy trips to Israel, and helped establish the Coalition for Interreligious Learning, which brought Catholic, Jewish, and Muslim educators together to discuss and change how other religions are portrayed in religious school textbooks. She serves on our National Advisory Board here at the Bernardin Center, the Advisory Council of the Sisters of Zion, and was moderator for the 2009 International Jewish Christian Symposium in Jerusalem, sponsored by the Focolare, which is a Catholic lay movement. She was a presenter on the topic of interfaith education at the International Intercultural Dialogue Platform, sponsored by Turkish Journalists Association in 2004. Emily is a really trusted and wonderful friend of the Bernardin Center, and we really cherish her friendship and the leadership that she's shown in the community here over these years. So welcome, Emily. I'm gonna introduce everyone before we start with the speakers. Dr. Marcia Hermansen is the Director of Islamic World Studies Program and Professor in the Theology Department at Loyola University, Chicago, where she teaches courses in Islamic studies and the academic study of religion. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago in Arabic and Islamic studies. In the course of her research and language training, she lived in extended periods in Egypt, Jordan, India, Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan. And she conducts research in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and Urdu, as well as the major European languages. Wow. Her books include Muslim Theology, The Voices of Muslim Women. This is forthcoming. Voices of Muslim Women Theologians, excuse me. So that book will be coming out soon. And she has written several other books and contributed to numerous articles in the fields of Islamic thought, Sufism, Islam, and Muslims in South Asia, and Muslims in America, as well as women in Islam. John Nilson is a professor at Loyola University as well. Professor Nilson received his BA and STB degrees from the University of St. Mary of the Lake before earning his doctorate from the University of Notre Dame. Before coming to Loyola in 1975, he taught at Illinois Benedictine and the University of Dallas, and he's had visiting professorships here at Catholic Theological Union, as well as the General Theological Seminary, the Episcopal Seminary in New York. And he was president of the Catholic Theological Society of America from 2002 to 2003. His current work is on the study of the role of the church vis-a-vis racism, and his interests include ecclesiology, ecumenism, Roman Catholicism in the 19th and 20th centuries, theological method, and African American religious thought. He also is a prolific writer, and he published Nothing Beyond the Necessary in 1995 and Hearing Past the Pain in 2007. And on the website, there's also a very long list of his other articles and publications. So 3 wonderful panelists for us this evening. So welcome, all of you.
I want to thank the Good Faith Planning Committee, which has excused me from coming to meetings. And of course, Oliver Nicklin, for this opportunity to examine authority in Jewish tradition and the parameters of dissent. Is that better? After a quick overview, I'm going to concentrate on some examples of dissenting ideas, thoughts, and behaviors that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's a lot to cover in 20 minutes. I hope it'll be a little bit less, but fasten your seatbelts. The classic Jewish work, Pirkei Avot, The Ethics of the Fathers, begins with the following statement. Moses received Torah from God at Sinai. He transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the members of the great assembly. Reading carefully, we see that Moses received Torah, not the Torah, which would be the Pentateuch or the 5 books of Moses, but according to the sages, Moses received on Mount Sinai all of Torah, the Talmud and the oral law, as well as the 5 books of Moses. The oral law is a legal commentary which explains how God's commandments are to be carried out. Rabbi Daniel Gordis explains it this way. Ours is a tradition that insists that God has spoken, yet Judaism is open to a variety of possibilities of how God spoke and what, in fact, God said. While we look to God as the ultimate authority, Judaism is replete with examples of people who challenge God, going back to Abraham challenging God's decision about destroying Sodom in Genesis 18. 2 of the most famous sages, Hillel and Shammai, lived in the 1st century before the Common Era. The Talmud records over 300 differences of opinion between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. Note, I said the Talmud records the differences. These are dissenting views enshrined in the text for generations to see and to mull over. While the rabbis of the Talmud generally sided with the rulings of the school of Hillel, the sages believed that both views were valid. Both views were valid. The greatness of the academies of Shammai and Hillel is that despite their serious differences, they married among themselves, ate by each other, and generally behaved as one people. The way they handled dissent was with deep respect toward another. Hillel and Shammai were part of what we now call the Rabbinite tradition. In their time, they would have identified with the Pharisees rather than other dissenting groups like the Sadducees. Both Sadducees and Pharisees accepted the Torah, but argued over the validity of the oral law, with the Sadducees rejecting that rabbinic law. Modern Jews are heirs to the Pharisaic tradition. The Pharisees themselves were divided over the rebellion against Rome in 70 CE. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, representing a minority opinion, urged accommodation with Rome. The Talmud tells how ben Zakkai was smuggled out of Jerusalem to meet with the Roman general Vespasian. Believing that Rome would prevail, ben Zakkai asked Vespasian to spare the academy in Yavna and the family of Rabban Gamliel. In his Understanding Jewish History, Stephen Boehm explains how ben Zakkai's request gives us insight into how the rabbis coped with the destruction through the emergence of new rabbinic leadership, a leadership that was both acceptable to Rome, but also maintained a continuity with the ancient past. With the destruction of the temple, it was the Pharisees who encouraged Jews to believe they could access God's revelation without animal sacrifices. The synagogue replaced the temple as the locus of Jewish worship. The rabbinate replaced the priesthood as the arbiter of Jewish law and practice. and Judaism survived the forcible dispersion of the Jewish people from their ancient homeland. First-century dissenters, for the most part, disappeared with the exception of the followers of Jesus. The dominant religious authority shifted from Jerusalem to Babylonia and eventually fragmented. There were learned and influential rabbis like Saadia Gaon in the 10th century, Rashi in 11th century France, and Maimonides in 12th century Egypt. All of these rabbis had both followers and dissenters in their own time. The situation of the Muslim Jews evolved somewhat differently than in Christian lands, and since the majority of American Jews are really descendants of European Judaism, I'm going to focus on that history. Through the Middle Ages, Jews suffered through the Crusades, expulsions, pogroms, massacres, and forced conversions. Various false messiahs arose in Jewish communities to offer an alternative possibility and to challenge Jewish authorities. Throughout, Jews saw themselves and were certainly viewed by others as a separate and distinct people with distinct history and links to a specific place, as well as religious practices and beliefs. That all Jews were responsible one for another was an important concept of Jewish belief in the diaspora. The Enlightenment brought further challenges when Jews were released from the ghettos of Europe. Inside the ghetto, the power and influence of the rabbi was bolstered by communal sanction. When Jews could not live outside the ghetto walls, individual dissenters had to accommodate their behavior, if not their thoughts, to prevailing norms, or risk being shunned or thrown out of the community. Once Jews were allowed to live where they wanted, to attend university, and to take up varied occupations, many Jews embraced the dress, attitudes, and customs of their Christian neighbors. The power and influence of rabbis and communal leadership waned. Once adherence to Judaism was a choice, no longer forced on Jews by the prevailing church or secular authorities, the competing influences of secularism and conversion to Christianity became a serious threat. Some Jews turned inwardly and intensified their orthodoxy, urging greater separation from the Christian and secular worlds. Rabbi Abraham Geiger in Germany offered an alternative to mass defection, or orthodoxy. He suggested modernizing Jewish worship. Rather than viewing this innovation as a dissent from orthodoxy, Geiger characterized it as part of a continuum in Judaism's evolution and adaptation. German congregations introduced various changes in Jewish worship, including mixed seating of men and women, observing 1 instead of 2 days of the holidays, and introducing cantors, choirs, and organs. Orthodox rabbis saw these changes as encouraging a kind of Christianization of Judaism and rejected the changes and the changers. The leading figure of Orthodox Jews in Germany in the 1800s, Samson Raphael Hirsch, aspired to fuse European culture with unqualified loyalty to rigorously observed traditional Judaism, a kind of neo-Orthodoxy, which I think has had a profound influence on modern Orthodox Judaism. These two opposing paradigms came to America with the immigration of German Jews in the 1840s and 50s. The immigrants arrived for the most part as individuals, not as communities of Jews, and few rabbis came with the early waves. For Jews, the role of rabbi is as a teacher and legal religious decisor. Rabbis are not needed for personal sacramental observances. Knowledgeable lay people can lead prayers, do circumcision, witness to the validity of a marriage, and perform rites of burial. In 1885, a formal gathering of Reform Jews adopted the Pittsburgh Platform, which stressed that Reform Jews must only accept laws that elevate and sanctify individuals' lives and must reject those customs and laws that are not adopted to the views and habits of modern civilization. The idea of Jewish peoplehood was also jettisoned. Shock over those radical changes enumerated in the Pittsburgh Platform spurred some traditional Jews to establish a more moderate response to both modernity and orthodoxy. Conservative Judaism offered a positive attitude toward modern culture, acceptance of critical scholarship of sacred text, and a commitment to Jewish observance, including Jewish law. Conservative Judaism dissented from orthodoxy over whether Jewish law is divine or is divinely inspired. By 1935, the Reform movement underwent an evaluation, became somewhat more traditional. The yearning for a return to Zion was and still is a deeply embedded in the ritual life of religiously observant Jews. Modern Zionism was one of several Jewish responses to the rise of nationalism in the 19th century. Zionism reflected a desire both to construct a Jewish national life in the ancestral homeland and to protect Jews from outbursts of anti-Semitism. Initially, Orthodox religious leaders rejected Zionism because it was deemed yet another secular and secularizing movement, anathema to religious life. Also, by calling for an ingathering of Jews, Zionism appeared to be an attempt to force the coming of the Messiah before God's appointed time. By the late 19th century, however, several prominent Orthodox rabbis recognized the need to take part in the national reawakening process and to influence the reconstruction of a new Jewish identity. Early Reform Judaism was anti-Zionist, believing the diaspora was necessary for Jews to be a light unto the nations. Those views changed with the rise of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. There are those in the Haredi, or the ultra-Orthodox community, who continue to reject Zionism completely because they believe that only God can mandate and effect a return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. However, with the exception of the Haredi community and a small group of anti-Zionists, most American Jews see Zionism as well within the mainstream of Jewish thinking. Anti-Zionists are now seen as serious dissidents, and Zionism should not be confused with acceptance or rejection of specific Israeli policies. Up until the 1960s, Reform and Conservative Judaism were the dominant streams in the U.S., and tension existed between the Reform and Conservative and also between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodoxy. Several factors came together to increase interest in and adherence to Orthodox Judaism around the 1960s, and the number of Jews attending Orthodox synagogues and following an Orthodox lifestyle began to grow. Still, however, Orthodox Judaism represents probably under 20% of affiliated Jews in America. At some point, prominent Orthodox rabbis became much more public in their criticism of Reform and Conservative practices and rabbis. They refused to join communal rabbinic organizations or participate in events with Conservative and Reform rabbis. Orthodox rabbis do not accept Reform and Conservative conversions. That tension continues to exist today. In 1983, the Reform movement broke completely with Conservative and Orthodox Judaism and declared that a child born of one Jewish parent, whether it's the mother or the father, is under the presumption of being Jewish, provided his or her Jewishness is activated. And this was a complete change from Jewish law, which for centuries has said a Jewish child is born of a Jewish mother or undergoes a conversion. This really separated the Reform movement from both Conservative and Orthodox. It should be clear by now that nothing is very monolithic in Judaism, and that includes Orthodoxy. While the Reform and Conservative movements have distinctive ideologies in theory, if not in practice, what we call Orthodox Judaism in America is diverse in outlook and practice. There is no chief rabbi in America. What Orthodox Jews share is a commitment to Jewish law and religious practice. Yet even within religious practice, there are leniencies and there are stringencies. One area of struggle for Orthodox Judaism is the role of women in the synagogue and in public leadership. While Jewish boys have a rite of passage at age 13, the bar mitzvah, marking the moment when they become responsible to follow the commandments, Jewish girls had no comparable religious ceremony. Formal ceremonies for girls began in Reform and conservative circles in the 1950s, and today girls and boys are treated more or less equally in those liberal synagogues. Orthodox synagogues strongly resisted any such equalization, but in the last 2 decades, many Orthodox synagogues began to offer some celebratory rite of passage for girls that is distinct and not to be confused with the boys' celebration or what the other movements do. Reform Jews began ordaining women as rabbis in the 1970s, and the conservative movement followed in the 1980s. Orthodox Jews continue to struggle with whether it is permissible for women to be rabbis, with some Orthodox rabbis saying, absolutely not now, not ever, and others seeking ways to allow women leadership roles in synagogue and worship activity. What I think is significant about the example of women rabbis in bar mitzvah, and there are many other examples as well, is that they show, despite a rejection of Reform and conservative Judaism ideology and practice, Orthodox Jews are influenced by the other movements, as the liberal movements are influenced by Orthodoxy. Another area of difference that has particular resonance for us in this room is the Orthodox rejection of interreligious dialogue. As recently as a few weeks ago, a prominent Orthodox rabbi affiliated with Yeshiva University wrote a harsh critique of rabbis who are involved in Christian-Jewish dialogue, particularly in Israel. He decried any theological discussion with Christians as violating Jewish law. While his opinion will certainly influence those of his followers, those who follow his leadership, it will not, I think, have a strong impact in general on interfaith dialogue, where Reform and conservative rabbis have been active participants for decades, and increasingly Orthodox rabbis are actually joining, I think. I began by quoting Pirkei Avot, and I would like to close with another passage. Any controversy that is for the sake of heaven shall in the end be resolved. A controversy that is not for the sake of heaven shall not be resolved. Maimonides explains the difference is in the intent of those involved. Those who wish to instruct others, although they may differ, will be rewarded. Those who wish to cause others to sin will be punished. Some Jewish leaders worry that Judaism is so filled with disagreement and dissent that it will not exist by the 22nd century. That worry itself has existed for at least 100 years. Yet, here we are. Personally, I am greatly enriched in my religious observance by the diversity of voices within my own tradition and from the examples that I see in the religious observance of my Muslim and Christian neighbors.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And I would also like to thank the Bernardin Center and In Good Faith for this invitation to speak. And I know I've been in the audience many times, and it's a great opportunity to be here as a presenter. My kind of short title is Authority and the Parameters of Dissent in Sunni Islam. A Catholic colleague of mine who teaches Islam at a Catholic institution told me that on one occasion, when the local bishop was visiting, a discussion emerged as to whether this colleague of mine needed a mandatum to teach. And the bishop told him, well, you don't need a mandatum from us. You should probably ask the Muslims for their equivalent, since what you teach is Islam. That concept actually made me a bit startled. No such system of authorization exists for Muslims, but if it did, I wonder if I would get one. I had a second thought about tonight's topic. Once we consider the parameters of authority in Islam,
We might come to agree that it is a lenient and open tradition in allowing so many varieties of interpretation. However, looking at some of the headlines, one might get the impression that Islam, in fact, exercises the strictest and most severe control of dissent and silences those who challenge authority. So which is it? What constitutes authority in Islam? First, let's consider a few passages from the Quran. First of all, 4:59. Believers, obey Allah and obey the Messenger and those in authority among you. Ulul Amr in Arabic, literally those who can command. Second passage. Once Allah and His Messenger have decided on a matter, it is not up to a believer to have a choice about it. And whoever disobeys God or His Messenger has gone gravely astray. But how is such authority to be enforced? And should it be? And there's another phrase that's used a lot in the Islamic tradition, al-amr bil ma'ruf, the same word, amr, command. Command the good is enjoyed repeatedly. Individual Muslims are told they should command the good. So is this a collective moral authority, or could it possibly lead to vigilantism in having that authority to enforce what one thinks is correct? So let us first consider authority more broadly, and here I'm drawing on some of Bruce Lincoln's theorizing. He distinguished between being in authority and being an authority. Being in authority is by virtue of the office one holds. It's not really a matter of your private conscience. You are representing the institution. It's executive authority, the authority of political leaders, rulers, parents, military commanders. Being an authority is having perceived expertise in a matter, agreeing on a shared tradition. It's epistemic authority, that of technical experts or scholars. So I might say that I think I'm on this panel as an authority, as a Muslim scholar and an academic, but I do not claim to be in authority. In terms of our interest tonight, one can speak of religious, moral, and epistemic authority in Islam as favoring generally the model of being an authority. It's more historically invested in the person than in an office or institution. And it's also, it seems to me, enacted in that way. That having been said, sometimes in certain contexts, the right appearance, official title or designation, or background invests a Muslim representative with authority, and sometimes it does not. So I'd like to, and there's so many, it's so wonderful to follow the presentation on Judaism because there are in fact so many parallels. It's like to understand authority and dissent in Islam, you have to, I think, know about some of the historical developments. So the verse I quoted from the Quran about God and the Prophet decreeing a matter indicates that the Prophet Muhammad is the authority who speaks for God. For Sunni Muslims, his immediate successors, the Khulafa, the caliphs, combined the political and religious function modeled by the Prophet during an ideal golden age, and that golden age itself becomes a source of authority. However, during the following period, the period of the Umayyad dynasty after 661 CE, the rulers no longer, held that legitimacy of combining religious and political authority. And a pious opposition arose in the community, so that authority became vested in the scholars and the scholarly tradition, not the political office. And we could say that that authority in the Prophet was considered in the Sharia, and the bearers of the Sharia were the learned scholars. The saying, the ulama, the learned scholars, are the heirs to the Prophet. And the scholars had their internal standards of authority or authoritative knowledge. They belonged to a school of law. We might consider that a professional guild, a system that guaranteed that a scholar was, shall we say, within the correct interpretations. Scholars received something called an ijaza, a permission certifying that they were able to transmit correct knowledge. They could be private individuals, or they could be employed by the rulers. Now let's fast forward to modernity. In the 20th century in the Muslim world, Muslims live in nation states, and those states may be Islamic states, declared Islamic states. I'm not using it normatively necessarily. They could be secular. They could be something in between, a combination, or Muslims could be settled in the West. So who today are the ulul amr, those who have authority? This is going to be important in defining dissent and responses to dissent. Is it a power issue or a doctrine issue? You know, who is a dissenter and who is going to enforce the fact if somebody has dissented? And what is going to be enforced by religious authority and what is being dissented? So we have a hadith that Anas reported that the Messenger of Allah said, quote, "Whoever offers the prayers as we do, turns his face to our Qibla, and eats the animal slaughtered by us, he is a Muslim for whom is the covenant of Allah and the covenant of the Messenger of Allah. So do not violate Allah's covenant." This hadith, I could say, illustrates the concept of what some scholars have called orthopraxy in Islam. You know, consistency of practice, doing things in the same way. So much about what is, you know, dissent from an Islamic point of view is more about somebody practicing in a different way. That doesn't mean, however, that there is not somewhere an idea of orthodoxy or right belief, but exactly who gets to define that and what would eventually be considered outside of that. Early disputes rocked the Muslim community, and there's something, I mean, it's still in play today, the word, but in the early community, this concept arose of takfir. You may know that kufr, denying God, is the ultimate sin. And so takfir is saying that another Muslim has gone outside, perhaps dissented so much that they're outside the pale completely. And this led to violent activity in the early Muslim community with one group, the Kharijites, saying these people have either acted or believed in such a way that they're no longer entitled to be considered Muslims, therefore we should attack them. And the response of the majority was, no, that's not up to us to decide. We must postpone it until Judgment Day, and God will decide who is a Muslim. So the Sunni perspective comes out of that experience. The Sunnis are the descendant of the postponers and till Judgment Day. And so generally one does not go so far as to just saying that somebody has gone beyond the pale. You know, one description of Islamic thought or Islamic identity I like very much is the idea of kind of concentric circles. And each Muslim group probably thinks that they are part of the group that's right in the center. You know, so the Sufis say, well, anyone who follows the Sharia, that's like the shell of the walnut. And then you actually have the walnut itself, that's a little closer to the center. But we, the Sufis, we're right in the center, and that's the oil or the essence of the walnut. Well, that's the Sufi version. But you might have the version of Islamists who say that they're the core Muslims or they're the vanguard of the Muslims. But it doesn't mean that the others are not Muslim or that they're outside. They're just not the same in the center. And of course, there's a hadith about dissent and authority, and there's two versions. One is there are 73 sects, and only one of them is on the right path. But there's actually another version that I'm afraid we don't hear as often, is that there's 73 sects and only one of them is going to hell. So there's this idea of consensus or ijma. Ijma, agreeing on something. And there are degrees of, is it kind of big tent ijma, like if all Muslims, or a whole lot of Muslims agree on something, that's Islamic. And then there's kind of scholarly consensus, which is a little more technical. And actually the name Sunni comes from the phrase Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, the people of the Sunnah, the path of the Prophet, and the Jama'ah, the community. So there's kind of a broad idea of authority and what is right. Scholar Sherman Jackson, who's also spoken at the group, says informal authority. So you don't have one person, one council, one group who mandates what is authoritative in Islam, but there are informal mechanisms, kind of a comfort zone of agreement. At the same time, ikhtilaf, or disagreement, according to a hadith, is a mercy for the community. So scholarly disagreement was accepted and as a mercy perhaps even embraced. As long as a scholar, according to Al-Ghazali, a scholar, or I think we could broaden it, I don't think he necessarily said it, an interpreter of tradition, made some reference point to the revealed texts and had some methodology of interpretation, that person was making effort to know what God wanted. And any human effort is an informed opinion, your best shot. You're rewarded for that. It is not the only way. So this kind of opened up the idea of interpretive possibilities. But is there an outer boundary? I talked about that circle. There must be some terms in Islam for beyond the pale. And there are ilhad, heresy, irtad, apostasy, zandaka, heresy, and bid'ah. Bid'ah, introducing something into Islam, an innovation. And there's actually one version is that any bid'ah is a heretical innovation, a misguidance. But there's also a juristic concept of a good innovation. So that, it can be a double-edged, depending which side you're on in a discussion. Some could be condemned for that, and other bid'ahs over time, because it's moving, the consensus is moving in history about both the scholarly consensus and the consensus of the Muslim community. But that movement is not very strictly defined, so that people are saying, well, now you're out, now you're in. There's this sense of, wait and see. So some classic examples of authority and dissent. One of the Islamic rulers, the Caliph al-Ma'mun, he died in 833, so it was a long time ago. He supported one theological movement called the Mu'tazilites, and he tried to make all the Muslims agree that the theology of the Mu'tazilites was correct, and he had almost a kind of mini inquisition where people were called up, do you believe that the Quran was created? And if you didn't, you might be thrown in jail. And that was a great flop in Islamic history, the idea to have a kind of state religious authority that enforced itself. Also, the idea of who is a saint in Islam is a kind of charismatic authority. If people think somebody's a saint during their lifetime, they're a wali, they're a friend of God, close to God, then they are. There's no body that exists that after the fact will kind of weigh and measure and test the miracles and say. It's just kind of what people agree on. The common person, the ammi, in Islamic law, is supposed to follow an expert scholar. That's called taqlid. But they have a choice of asking for opinions from various scholars and picking the one that their conscience feels is the best. But taqlid as kind of a principle of authority, you were talking about some disagreements in the Jewish community. There are those Muslims who recommend performing taqlid of a particular school of law, that's the safest way to be sure that the classical traditional opinions in Islamic law, one should follow those. That's called taqlid. But there are those that say those scholars of the past were great, but they were human beings and we are human beings. So we should be able to exercise a more free interpretive authority, ijtihad, go back to the Quran. But ijtihad cuts two ways. There are liberal progressives who say go back to the Quran and discover the spirit of what it says. And there are literalists who say go back to the Quran and follow it literally. So it can be either liberal or conservative in terms of that debate. Also, being an authority in Muslim context today is changing. There are challenges to traditional scholarly authority. There are other sources of knowledge, science, a shared morality, the idea of an overlapping consensus. If we have a particular doctrine or a practice, does it meet the test of seeming sensible and moral to a broader community? These are not questions that were asked in the past. Internet Islam, that somebody can go online and keyword search a hadith database or the Quran and kind of be their own mufti or their own mujtahid. And there are those who are saying, but there's a tradition, there's a way of doing these things. To go off on your own, you might come out with a rogue opinion or simply pursue your own desires. And in the tradition, authority kept that from happening. Today, it's much more wide open. So let me conclude with some contemporary cases of dissent. And perhaps in the question period, you'll think of ones that I didn't think of. Actually, my own professor, Fazlur Rahman at the University of Chicago, I consider maybe the greatest, okay, maybe we shouldn't say greatest, great Muslim scholar of the 20th century. But some of his ideas were considered very provocative in his day. And he was under pressure to leave his native Pakistan because his ideas were too liberal, including some suspicion of the Hadith corpus and seeing the Quran as historically contextualized and not divorced from the lived experience of the Prophet Muhammad. That was too radical for the 1960s. So, dissent, but again, that's that issue of how is it enforced, right? It was not a Muslim body, it was not a council of Muslim scholars who issued this opinion, but it was a pressure that emerged and there were politics involved. We see many cases like that. Or the Egyptian professor Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, who did a critical historical kind of literary approach to the Quran, and in Egypt was declared an apostate and had to leave the country and ended up taking refuge, the late Professor Abu Zaid, taking refuge in the West. So these are cases, that one hears about why these persons within the tradition, despite all that I've said about interpretive flexibility, came under pressure. And where did that pressure come from? And okay, we don't have a religious body that is telling Muslims how they have to conform, but in the absence of such a body, are individuals becoming vigilantes and trying to enforce that in other ways, or are people vulnerable to certain political trends? And perhaps I should mention the gender issue. I'm thinking about woman-led prayer. Is that an act of dissent? Or a woman in a mosque, there is a barrier in the mosque. What if a woman decides to come and pray in front of the barrier? Is that, how will that be, what kind of reverberations are there in the community? So some of the things that have gone on in the Jewish community, in the West, in the diaspora, in the modernity, Muslims, you may not see it so often, how those things are coming into existence, but probably those kind of questions will be more present in the future. Thank you.
Well, I too am grateful to the Bernardin Center for this invitation, although I'm a little apprehensive. Some years ago, my son was approaching his 16th birthday. And as you know, when you're 16, the state of Illinois, in its dubious wisdom, seems willing to grant someone a driver's license. And the thought of my son driving terrified me. And so one night at dinner, he happened to mention that they had had a program on safe driving at school that day. So my ears perked up, and I said, well, what happened? What was that like? And he said, oh, Dad, it was terrible. And I said, oh, well, what happened? He said, well, Dad, it was the coroner from Lake County. and she showed us these pictures of accidents, and there was a lot of blood and car wrecks, and she said how awful it was to have to go up to people's houses at 2 or 3 in the morning and tell them that their kid was hurt real bad, and he kind of shuddered. So in my best parental tone of voice, I said, well, did you learn something from her presentation? And he said, yeah, I never want to be a coroner. So my task tonight is a lot harder than the coroner's, because the possibilities for misunderstanding here are multiplied in so brief a presentation on so complex a subject. But I hope at least a lot of the essentials could be put into 3 main points. The first point would be that for Christians, there really is only one authority, and that authority is the triune God. The God who is the creator and sustainer of all that is, the God with us, Emmanuel, comes to be with us in the person of Jesus Christ, the God who as Spirit continues with us in the community of those who are the followers of Jesus, yet also in God's generosity pours God's self out as grace for all of humanity. Okay? So therefore, other realities, whether we're talking about texts, or we're talking about persons, or we're talking about precedents, these are only authoritative insofar as they reveal this God, and insofar as they promote God's desire to be in loving communion with us, and God's desire that we be in communion with one another. So, yeah, there are authoritative texts, okay? The Bible, Scripture, including the Hebrew Bible, held sacred by Jesus himself, and then the so-called New Testament, the 27 books written in and for the early Christian community, adopted by the community as the reliable guides to the meaning of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as the community is living forward, okay? There are texts called creeds, sort of accurate summaries, accurate, succinct summaries that are recognized by the church as providing a guide for belief. Often in the early period, these creeds were developed in the context of the baptismal ceremony. The 2 most prominent and authoritative in Christianity are the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed, which is often recited by the whole community at a particular liturgical service. But there are also other creeds recognized by other churches. For instance, the Schleichtime Confession, is a creed, very prominent in the Anabaptist tradition. Closer to our own time, there is the Barmen Declaration of 1933, where Karl Barth took the leading role in developing a statement in which Christians took a decisive stand against the glorification of Hitler that was gathering steam. Okay? Now, there are also, in the category of texts, dogmas. Okay? And here too we've got declarations which are formally adopted by the church, when situations of ambiguity or disagreement threaten to divide the community, to introduce, real schism and division, or to fatally obscure the saving meaning of the Jesus event. In other words, an interpretation of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that would somehow occlude what happened in and for us, in Jesus' ministry. So, authoritative texts, there are others, but there are also authoritative persons, okay, which we call church authorities, okay? But again, these people are authorities only insofar as they reveal God and promote God's desire to be that we be in communion with God, that we be in communion with one another. So these church authorities, these persons, are the acknowledged leaders of the community. They go by different titles. They have office, as Marcia indicates, in different ways. Elected, appointed, chosen, different titles: preachers, ministers, superintendent, priests, bishops, and of course, the Bishop of Rome for the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. And the role of these folks is to serve the community, to foster fidelity to Jesus, to serve the community so that the community in turn can serve the world. Okay? Now, there are other persons whom the community recognizes as having a serious claim to attention because they are kind of model Christians. They in their lives, in their words, they kind of embody what it means to be a disciple of Jesus in and for this particular time. These are people whom we call saints, whether they're formally canonized by a church, the Roman Catholic Church or another church, or just, so here we're talking about someone like, St. Francis of Assisi. But then there are also people who are sort of informally saints. Think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Think of Oscar Romero, okay? People, who in and for certain segments of the church, even for the universal church, are recognized. These people are special. These people are special. Their lives call us to reflection and attention, in some kind of response, okay? There are other authorities, of course, for particular groups of Christians. I think this is most prominent in the case of a religious order. St. Benedict founds the Western monastic tradition. For Benedictines, Benedict is an authority. Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits, for whom Marcia and I are very grateful for our paychecks. He's a very important figure, in the history of the church, I think, But, that's just me. Finally, precedent, or the more technical theological term, tradition. Tradition can be authoritative. Because the idea is that the belief and the practice of the community over time is not safeguarded from error or misdirection, but is certainly strongly influenced by the Spirit of God. And so over time, again, the worship and the belief and practice of the community can become a resource and a guide, a source of wisdom for life, belief, and practice, in the present. So tradition becomes important, okay? So now these are just examples, all right? This is not a list of, an exhaustive list of authorities, for Christianity. I mean, of course, there are moral norms, such as those, found in the Ten Commandments. The official worship of the community, especially over time, is also a source. There's a Latin phrase, lex orandi, lex credendi. The law of prayer is the law of belief. That we want to know what a community really believes, see how they worship. This is especially strong in the Episcopal Church, as they have their difficulties and disagreements on the so-called theological level or the doctrinal level. Many Episcopalians say, yes, but we are united in worship. We have the Book of Common Prayer. Okay, so that becomes very important. We can also say that the consensus of theologians is important. As Marcia referred to the scholars in Islam, there's an analogous role played by theologians in Christianity, no matter what denomination one happens to belong to. Now, important point. In Roman Catholicism, at least, I can't speak for other traditions, the authority of one's own conscience is supreme. This is often forgotten, but the role of conscience is underlined, especially in the Second Vatican Council, 1965, For, says the council, one has in one's heart a law written by God. To obey it is one's very human dignity. According to it, one would be judged. So we've got multiple authorities here in Christianity, and when they're all working together, when they're harmonizing, the community is enriched. Christian truth is symphonic, in the memorable phrase of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Which brings me to the second point. Problems arise when widespread and substantial divergences emerge among these various authorities, okay? Then the fundamental issue becomes which of these authorities most accurately expresses God's will for us here and now. I was in a meeting with an archbishop and a theologian. There were other people involved, but the two main actors here, the archbishop and the theologian. And the issue before us is, what should the Roman Catholic Church do if the Episcopal Church goes ahead and ordains a partnered gay man as a bishop? The archbishop said, pretty straightforwardly, if the Episcopal Church goes ahead and does this, we need to break off relations with them because they have fundamentally broken with the tradition. The theologian said, well, excuse me, Archbishop, I have to disagree. They have not broken with the tradition. The tradition has never considered this issue before. Never considered. So you had the church leader, you have tradition, you have the theologian. It's all working and more or less at cross purposes there. The theologian won the argument there. We continued relationships, the conversation continued, okay? Now, there are many disagreements, many divergences within the churches themselves and among Christianity as a whole. So what are the parameters? What are the limits beyond which these differences can't be tolerated, must somehow be resolved, okay? To answer that question, we have to answer three previous questions. First of all, is this a substantial disagreement? Is this, does this get to the heart of what we're about? Does it involve the center, the axis, of the Christian faith? And secondly, even if it does, is this a difference that would be tolerable within a deeper and more fundamental unity by which we are brought and held together? And number three, is this a disagreement that threatens to tear the community apart? Is this something that needs to be resolved, or else we are just going to, is this something that is just so widespread and so volatile that it requires, some kind of intervention? These are not easy questions to answer. These are not always easy questions to answer. And so there's no guarantee that these questions are always going to be answered accurately and wisely. And we know, sadly, that church leaders can mistake a minor or a disputed issue for a central and settled issue, as in the case of the conversation between the archbishop and the theologian. And they can sometimes try to impose their view on the rest of the community, and it becomes increasingly obvious as time goes on that this is an unworkable strategy. This is simply an unworkable strategy because there are other authorities involved. And the more this kind of strategy is tried, the unconvinced simply leave, they form another church, or they simply walk away and join the increasing number of unchurched people, in our country. So persuasion and not coercion becomes more and more necessary as more and more people have access to the same information that a church leader has, okay? And as people come to different conclusions, as is happening, I think, right now in my own church with the issue of homosexuality. You have different authorities, and this is not an issue that's being resolved, and I think I agree with the theologian. The tradition has never faced this particular issue. So why do Christians care so much about these disputes? Okay, if there are disagreements, serious or otherwise, let the people who believe one way go form their church, people who believe the other way go form their church, and, that'll be fine. And in fact, that's what a lot of Christians have done. The number of Christian denominations in the United States runs into the hundreds, okay? But it must not be so, because Division is antithetical to what Christianity is supposed to be about, okay? And that brings me to the third point. For Christianity, unity is imperative, necessary, non-negotiable. Division strikes into the very heart of the Christian mission and witness. For unity, for communion, again, communion between God and ourselves, communion with one another. The Gospel of John. Jesus prays, "My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I have given them the glory that you gave me, that they may be one as we are one, I and them and you and me, so that they may be brought to complete unity. Then the world will know that you sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me." So a divided church, a divided Christianity is not the Christianity willed by Jesus himself, okay? So the Catholic Church, at least, has developed a unique office to serve as the symbol and, if need be, the guarantor of unity, if need be. So in crises, when unity is seriously imperiled, Roman Catholicism has a church office empowered to declare not the personal view of the office holder, but the faith of the church. What is it that we believe? What holds us together? What's sort of our glue here, okay? And therefore set certain limits, on dissent and disagreement. Which, of course, raises a whole other set of complex issues connected with the papacy. I was able to teach at Loyola's Rome Center in 1998-99, and spent a lot of time in St. Peter's because people would come and visit. We'd take them over. And one time, I was in St. Peter's with a couple of friends, and there was a tour going through St. Peter's, and I happened to overhear the group as they approached the main altar, and the tour guide said, "Now, you see the papal throne? When the Pope sits there and says something, Catholics believe God is speaking." And it was all I could do to go over to the people and say, "Get your money back." The person does not know what they're talking about. Get your money back at least, No, it's not the Pope on his own. It's linked to the faith of the whole church, sustained by the Spirit. I feel like I've skated over a lot of issues, but to treat these issues at the length they deserve would probably make you fear you'll never see your loved ones again. So, thank you for listening.